My name is Monk Rowe, and we are filming during the International Association of Jazz Educators Conference in New York. I'm very pleased to have trumpet player Jimmy Owens with me, an educator and other things I'm sure we'll talk about along the way.
It's very
Thanks for
nice
coming.
being here.
You've been a lifelong resident of New York, is that right?
Yes.
Did you ever live anywhere else for any amount of time?
Lived other places. The only time I can say I really lived someplace else was 91 to 92 when I was a guest visiting professor at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music in Oberlin, Ohio. I lived there for a year, or actually 8 months. Other than that, the only time I could say I've lived places, I've spent as much as 3 and 4 months at a time in Europe, you know, where I was living there, you know, relaxing. And me and my wife usually spend 1 or 2 months during the summertime in Europe. You know.
What brought you to the point as a young man or even a child where you felt like music was going to be your career? Was there a defining moment, do you think, or was it gradual?
It was not a defining moment. It was an argument when I said to my mother and father, no, I'm not going to be an electronic engineer. I want to be a musician. I'm not going to go to the Brooklyn Technical High School. I'm going to go to the High School of Music and Art. So I guess that was the defining moment. No, but seriously, I guess the defining moment was when I started to play the instrument, because it was from that point on that I had the feeling that I wanted to be a professional musician. And that was at age 10. You know, by the time I was 14, I really had the feeling inside that I wanted to be a professional musician. Then at 16, I auditioned and got into the Newport Youth Band that was run by Marshall Brown, and that kind of put the top on the lid from the standpoint of being a professional musician, the training and everything. I had been in the High School of Music and Art for 1 year. That was my second year in the school that I was in the Newport Youth Band. And we would have to stay off from school sometimes Mondays and Fridays because we had concerts, you know. And we had the greatest musicians teaching us. So that all added up to giving me a good insight on wanting to be a professional musician. My chief mentor at the time was Donald Byrd. I studied with him when I was 14 years old. And living in New York, growing up in New York, at 14 and 15, I was hanging out in the clubs. And a lot of the musicians after the Newport Youth Band, whatnot, they knew me. So they would manage to let me come in to the dressing room or something, you know, like at the Metropole. That used to happen. And that's where I met Red Allen and J.C. Higginbottom, Buster Bailey, and Charlie Shavers, people like that. And I must say I was a little different than most of the other musicians my age who were coming up. They didn't have their appreciation for the older musicians. I had their appreciation for the Clifford Browns and the Miles Davis and the Dizzy Gillespies, you know, and the Freddie Hubbards, who was 5 years older than me. But I also had it for those older musicians also. Somehow, I guess it was just some kind of something that was instilled in me when I was born.
Oh, was there music in the household going on?
No, there was no music in my household.
Oh, it's interesting.
Live. There was music all the time, records. And my father would pick me up when I was 3 and 4 years old. We had a huge mirror in our living room, and he'd pick me up and dance with me to Stompy Jones or a Billie Holiday record or Art Tatum record. And I used to love to see myself in the mirror, you know. And I guess this is what put the sound of the music in my ear. I think he told me I was 4 years old. He could tell me, Jimmy, go play your favorite record. And I'd go among all the records and pull out this one record. It was a picture record. It had a picture on both sides. One side had a landscape scene, and the other side had a picture of a white woman. And it was a record by Charlie Shavers. On one side it was She's Funny That Way. On the other side it was a song called Dizzy's Dilemma. And that was my favorite record. I'd take it and put it on the 78 and put the needle on it. And sometimes I had to change the needle,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
put the needle, the arm down on it and play my favorite record. So I think that was the sound of the trumpet that was in my ear, because I don't remember any other trumpet players at that time. And as time went on, I remember many years after that, telling Charlie Shavers that story.
No, that's great.
You know?
Did the musicians that you met, either as teachers or just in the clubs, did you get a sense of them instilling you with other things just besides the playing of the music?
Well, I can say, I mentioned that Donald Byrd was my mentor, and he instilled in me what being a professional musician was. And he taught me about the business. You know, he was the first to start that, put it this way, and made me aware about copyright and about taking care of business. And then there were other musicians who were equally as important, who took it another step. Randy Weston was one of my mentors also. He taught me a lot about the business, you know, and publishing and how publishing works, you know. And I always had people like that to help me along the way. And then the other musicians, you know, by the time I was 17, I had graduated from school, high school, and I was in the fold of all of the clubs, and I used to go to the clubs, and I'll never forget the manager of Birdland, 52nd Street and Broadway, the original Birdland, Johnny Gary, the night that he says, "All right, you can let him in. Let the kid in." You know, and then they finally knew me as Jimmy, and when I started to play in Birdland on Monday nights and a whole week and everything, you know, it was great. But I remember that time that Johnny Gary told Pee Wee Marquette, "Okay, let him in for free." And boy, that was something very special.
That was.
I talked to Johnny Gary about that now. Johnny is now about, I think he's 78 or something years old.
It's almost like an early form of paying your dues.
Right.
You know? First you get let in to listen, and then maybe later on they'll let you in to play. Wow, that's interesting. I had a little note here that in around 58 you had played alongside Miles Davis for something.
Well, what happened was my father took me to see Miles Davis. I'm 15 years old. And Miles was working at a club called Small's Paradise. He was doing a matinee. My father took me to see Miles, and when we got there, the band was off. They were on a break. So my father's at the bar, and I'm next to him, and I walked over to the bandstand, which was this high off the ground, you know. And I'm standing there. I've heard all of these stories about Miles Davis being a nasty person. I'm standing there with my hands behind my back, looking at the trumpet in the piano. I had never seen a blue trumpet before. And he had this horn that was tinted blue. And all of a sudden, someone slides down at the piano, and I see it's Miles, and he looks up at me. He's playing some chords, and he says, "You play trumpet, kid?" I said, "Yeah." So we played a little while, and he says, "Play me a tune." And he gave me his horn. So I took the horn, and I was going to take the mouthpiece out, and I said, take your mouthpiece. He said, "What you could do, play without a mouthpiece?" I said, "No, I got my own." I put my mouthpiece in the horn, and I played Walking. Okay? At which point, the musicians were coming back on the stage, and the last person on the stage, I mean, Miles took the horn back, you know. Last person on the stage was Bill Evans, and Miles said, "Hey, Bill, you hear this kid play?" "No." He says, Miles gave me the horn and said, "Go ahead, play it again." So I started to play Walking, and the whole band joined in. And when I say the whole band, that's Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, and Jimmy Cobb. and I play Walking, and I take a solo. We take it out. And Miles says, "Go ahead, play another one." And I play Bags Grew, you know, and Train takes a solo, you know, Cannonball takes a solo. Oh, it was unbelievable. Well, I mentioned specifically Jimmy Cobb because we played together many, many times. And he was teaching at the new school where I was teaching. And one day in the office, I bumped into him. And I said, "Hey, man, Cobb, I want to ask you something. You remember working at Small's Paradise with Miles?" He says, "Yeah, I remember working there." I said, "Well, you remember Matinee, the kid sat in with the band and played with?" He said, "You know, I do recall that." I said, "Man, that was me." He said, "What?" I said, "No, you remember that for sure?" He said, "I really remember that night because that was my first week working with the band, and I look up, and at the bar there is Philly Joe Jones, and I got so nervous." Well, when he told me that story, I just broke up, you know. And he really remembered that night, you know,
Wow.
and me sitting in with the band, or
Yeah.
a kid, young
Yeah.
kid sitting with the band.
That's a great story. I'm wondering what your father was
Well,
thinking while
you
this
know,
was going on.
It's funny because, oh, well, he was so happy, you
Yeah.
know, he was so proud. But Quincy Troop had called me when he was writing the book, the autobiography. And he said, "Jimmy," says, "Quincy Troop, I'm doing a book on Miles Davis, and I wanted to know if you had any stories." Listen, Quincy, I'd really like to talk to you, man, but the limousine is waiting for me. I'm going to Europe right this moment.
Oh.
And he said, "Well, when you could be back?" I said, "Well, I'm not going to be back for about 3 months." And so I missed the whole
Missed the
situation,
beginning
you know.
of the book, yeah.
You know. And I mentioned that to Quincy a couple of weeks ago. He was in New York, and I reminded him. I said, "Hey, man, you still owe me an interview."
Yeah, well, I got it first. That's a great story. It's especially wonderful because I thought that was one of the great bands of all time. With,
Oh, yes.
with those, with Coltrane and Cannonball and Bill
That
Evans.
was my beginning of a friendship with Miles. Miles had come, and I have that date. I can't remember the date now, the exact date that I played, because they came out with a Miles Davis book that is like a calendar of all of his engagements. And that particular week, I think it was in June of 1958, shows that he was at Small's Paradise,
Yep.
and that he did a matinee.
Ah,
And what happened was then, a couple of weeks later, I played and sat in at a jam session, at a concert up in the Bronx. I lived in the Bronx, at a place called the International Inn. And it got a big write-up in the Amsterdam News. And Miles and his wife, Frances, were there in the audience because the musicians who were playing were Kenny Dorham, Hank Mobley, and Curtis Fuller. I don't remember who's in the rhythm section. But I remember that because Kenny Dorham let me play his trumpet. And I have pictures of me at 15 years old playing with Hank Mobley and pictures of me playing with Curtis Fuller. I told Curtis about this many times, and just last October we did a series of concerts in Europe, Curtis and myself, and we've played together many times and been on tours and everything. Well, I thought of it beforehand. I took this picture out, and I showed Curtis Fuller this picture, and he jumped.
wow.
Picture of me and him. I'm 15 years old.
Oh, gosh.
So,
Isn't it funny back then when people that are maybe 4 to 5 years older than you seem so much
oh,
older?
they're so much older.
You know, you figure, oh, they've got so much experience, but it's interesting that you say just like you were obviously probably kind of nervous playing with those guys, but there's Jimmy Cobb, and he's nervous because
Yeah, because
Philly Joe is there.
Exactly.
So I don't know who makes Philly Joe nervous, but probably nobody. At what point did you really start to make money, make a living of a sort?
Well, what happened was, after graduating from high school, my parents didn't have any money to send me to college. And just to tell you, the Manhattan School of Music cost $750 a year.
Mm-hmm.
That was the tuition. Juilliard was a little more expensive. They cost $900 a year, the tuition. They didn't have that. And I stayed home that summer and practiced, and I would practice 8, 9 hours a day. But by the fall, now my mother's working, my father worked at nights, so he was sleeping in the daytime. I would be in the front part of the house. We had a big apartment, it was like 8 rooms, front part of the house, and he'd be sleeping in the back. Didn't bother him. But come September, all of a sudden, my mother is after me that I'm going to have to be responsible, because someday I'll have a family and I'll have to support my family, so you have to go out and look for a job. And she couldn't understand that I was being responsible. I'd get in at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. At 9 o'clock I was up practicing until 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. I mean, just all day long. She didn't think that was responsibility, you know. I make them laugh when I talk about this now. Fortunately, both of my parents are still with me. They're both in their 90th year now.
That's wonderful.
You know. But to tell them about that, you know, they think about it. I think getting this job was the best thing that had ever happened to me. It's the only time in my life I've ever worked outside of music.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm 17 years old. My mother worked in a hospital in the Bronx, Lincoln Hospital, and she got me this job. I was called, the title of the job was, I was stationery clerk. I was in charge of ordering all of the paper goods for the hospital. Every form in the hospital had a little number, and I had to keep all of these in stock because, you know, if we ran out of death certificates, it would be a catastrophe. The doctor needed a death certificate and there were none. So other forms, you know. So I wound up doing this job. I didn't want to, of course, but I should say my mother made me do it, not so much my father, okay. I take this job. I work very hard 2 weeks out of the month. 1 week taking in requisitions of what is needed, ordering the supplies, putting the supplies in my little cubby, a little closet that had all this stuff, then filling the requisitions. And that all took 2 weeks out of the month. The other 2 weeks, I had very little to do. I would lock myself in my closet because I could lock the door from the inside, and I would practice with my mute. I'd practice. So the city of New York was paying me, I don't know, to take home some ridiculous fee like $99.51 every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
You know, the city of New York paid me for 2 weeks to practice, and the other 2 weeks to work hard. You know, what happened was I worked on that job for 1.5 years. I studied privately with very eminent brass. They called it troubleshooter. His name was Carmine Caruso.
Sure.
Brass players who had troubles, they would go to him. Well, I studied with Carmine for 1.5 years. I studied with the very eminent American composer Henry Brandt. And I was learning my skills, and I was saving my money to go to, at that time I really wanted to go to Juilliard because a lot of my friends had gone to Manhattan and they didn't seem to like it, you know. So I said I would go to Juilliard. I still had ambitions of playing European classical music, but still I was a jazz musician first.
Yeah.
I worked the job for a year and 3 months and told my boss, who never bossed me, told my boss, oh, Miss Alls, I'd like you to put in a slip saying that I'm going to quit in 2 weeks. So she says, oh, yeah, really? Okay, yeah, sure. She says, what are you going to do? Retire? So I said, well, I tell you what, I'm not going to retire, but I'm going to go out, and in the first job that I take, they knew I was a musician, I'm going to make 3 times as much money as I make here in 6 weeks. You know, they all laughed. Well, a week after, I approached her. I said, well, did you put in my resignation slip? She says, no. I said, no, I was serious. So I had to go into the administrative office and let them know. Last week she was supposed to put it in, and she didn't. I wanted to apply to last week, and so I quit. And within about 2 weeks, I did a job with Slide Hampton. We went down to North Carolina and played a concert. I made $350 for the concert, which was a lot more than $99.51 for 2 weeks in one night. Okay,
that's darn good money.
It was a lot of money,
especially for you were 18 or so.
Yeah, but it was me and Richard Williams.
Gee.
That was the trumpet section, and Slide Hampton and Garnett Brown was in the trombone section. Let's see. Hubert Laws was playing tenor saxophone. And I can't remember who else was in the band.
But
I mean, it was a great band. And Slide was very popular. You know, he'd had a hit, kind of a hit at that time called Sister Salvation. So we played all of this music. And that was, you know, one of the times of getting paid. Now, all of the time that I worked in the hospital, I didn't take any of the jobs that people were calling me for.
No.
I would refuse those jobs, and lots of musicians were calling me to work Monday night at Birdland and to do things. You know, on the weekend I would do some dance gigs type of thing, but I wasn't playing any jazz gigs because I was really just practicing. I didn't want to put myself out there before I was ready, in my opinion. So I could honestly say that Slide Hampton job was the first that I really got paid.
That's a great story too.
I went on from
timing
there.
is impeccable.
I went on from there to play with all of the masters of the music, and that's where I really feel very, very privileged. And like I said, other than that Lincoln Hospital job in the Bronx, I've never worked outside the music in all of my years, and that was...
Yeah, I'm looking at years, the mid-'60s, early mid-'60s, really a lot of different great names here that you were with, Maynard Ferguson and Jerry Mulligan and Charles Mingus.
Yeah, I worked with Mulligan for a shorter period of time. I worked at Birdland with him for, I think it was a 1-week engagement, and I did a few concerts. This was when he had the concert jazz band, which was a precursor to the Thad Jones-Mel Lewis band. Thad was in this band, Mel Lewis played drums in the band, and it was from that experience that Mel Lewis and Thad, well, I knew Thad, I met Thad some years before, invited me to be in the Thad Jones-Mel Lewis Jazz Orchestra. But I mean, my work with Lionel Hampton, and for the longer periods with Mingus, because I worked with Mingus 2 times in 1964 and again in '65. You know, all of that was a tremendous learning experience, not only learning musically, but learning how people maneuvered the audience in their hand. And I was very interested in seeing how people were able to be the masters of their audience. Lionel Hampton
Uh-huh.
was a lot different than Charles Mingus.
How did Charles Mingus maneuver an audience?
With his giving the feeling of being really crazy. He would walk into the club. We worked at the Village Gate.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Mingus would walk in dressed in a black suit and a bowler hat, okay? Impeccable, with a cane. Go into the dressing room, take all of his clothes off and put on an old dirty pair of blue jeans, a ripped up shirt, and that's what he'd go out on the stage and perform in. Then he would fire the band and keep part of the band on the stage, you know. And this was all part of his quote unquote show. Okay? You guys are not playing shit. Get out of here. You're fired. You're all fired. Y'all stay, you know. And then the small group would play with Lonnie and Charles McPherson and Danny Richmond. They would play, and he says, okay, maybe I'll hire y'all back. Y'all come on back, and, you know. So this kind of thing, you know, the audience was very interested in this.
Yeah.
And he managed to bait the audience all the time. Lionel Hampton is completely different. He baited them with the music.
Yeah. Well, when Mingus would do this, were you guys, let's say, in on it? Did you know that he was...
Well, we were in on it because it would happen 3 times a week, you know, that type of situation. You know, and he always, you know, was going to have us back, and we knew we weren't fired, you know. But that was the impression. Herbie Mann dealt with his audience another way, you know. So that was a learning process for me, just checking those things out. I guess I was looking to the fact of being a band leader at that time, and I wanted to know about those things.
Yeah.
And I think all of that helped me to be a much better band leader as time went on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit more than just playing the notes.
Oh, yes.
Right? Wow, it's very interesting. Going back a little bit to the Thad Jones-Mel Lewis group, was that group formed partly for people who were doing a lot of studio work and
basically that's what it was.
Yeah.
It was it wasn't formed for that reason. It was formed to have Thad write some music. And he used some of the best players in New York, who most of them were great jazz musicians, but who were very busy in the studios. You know, Snooky Young on trumpet, Jerome Richardson on saxophone, Richie Davis on the bass, Roland Hanna on the piano. All these guys were very, very busy in the studios. Jimmy Nottingham on trumpet. You know. And there were a group of us who were coming into the music. Eddie Daniels, Garnett Brown on trombone, myself, and we were the young musicians in the band. We used to rehearse Monday nights at midnight. Every Monday night at midnight. Okay? Because that was the time that everyone could make it. There were no record dates at that time. You know. We rehearsed in New York here in a place called Jim and Andy's. It was a local watering hole for musicians. And he had a rehearsal studio over the bar. And that's where we started to rehearse. And we rehearsed there for a while and then moved into A&R recording studios in Phil Ramone. And what Phil would do, he started to train young engineers how to record live music, a live big band, from our rehearsals. So it was one hand washes the other. He gave Thad the room to rehearse in, and he taught young engineers how to record instruments live. I wish I knew where all of those tapes were.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing.
Thad had them.
Yeah.
You know, they just disappeared because before Thad died, some people asked about those tapes. maybe Phil Ramone had them and he erased them, or I don't know what happened.
Wow.
But that's why the band was formed. And we rehearsed a good 3 months of Mondays when Thad came to us and said, listen, I was given a little offer. He said, won't pay a lot of money, maybe $20 a man, but I want to know if you want to go into the Village Vanguard on Monday night. So everybody said, yeah. So he told Max Gordon, yeah, okay, we'll go into the Village Vanguard, we'll do this. And at that particular time, this is 1965, 66, clubs in New York were really having a hard time. Clubs were closed Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and many times Thursday. They would open up either Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and close the rest of the days. Because it was just no business to fill them. People were not coming out. This Monday night was advertised, Thad Jones-Mel Lewis and the Jazz Orchestra, and it listed all of the musicians' names in the orchestra. I have a ad.
Do you? Oh,
from
that's
that
great.
period.
Good.
And I came to the Vanguard that night, and when I got out of the cab, there was a line up the block, almost around the corner, to 11th Street. What is this? I had to squeeze through the people to get in. And that's the way it was for the first number of weeks. Every Monday night, it was packed like that. People were just looking for some place to go and something different to see. And that was it. And we used to make enough money that one Monday night that Max was able to open up the club all week long. Whereas the Village Gate was closed Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And they were having things on the weekend only. Max opened his club up all week long.
Wow.
Because of the money that was made by Thad and Mel on those Monday nights. And I stayed with the band for about 3 months of Monday nights at the Vanguard. And then we had a situation in the band where you weren't supposed to take off. And nobody would take off. Okay, they had a record date, they give it to someone else because this was Monday night. Well, I had a conflict, and I went to Mel, because he was in charge of that part of the stuff. And I told him, listen, Mel, I have to take off for about 5 weeks because I'm going to Europe. I'm going to Japan. I'm working with Herbie Mann. And he didn't want me to take off. I said, well, wait a minute. So I wound up quitting. I had to quit. And Thad didn't know anything about that for a long time. He didn't know why I left.
I see.
And I worked with the band a number of times after that, but just as subs and stuff. So that, on leaving the band, that's why I'm not on any of the recordings, the first recordings that were made.
Boy, we sure wish those tapes were around.
Yeah.
Those early tapes.
Right.
Japan seems to be quite a mecca for jazz acts. They really enjoy the music over there.
They did. I can go back to 1966 with Herbie Mann. And then I went back to Japan a little later in that year with a special drum tour that had Art Blakey, Elvin Jones, Tony Williams, McCoy Tyner, Ben Tucker played bass, Wayne Shorter, and myself. It was fantastic, but it was a very bad tour in that the Japanese government had problems with American jazz musicians and narcotics, and narcotics at that time meaning marijuana. They had arrested a number of jazz musicians for the 2 previous seasons. So they were really on us all the time, and 2 of the musicians got arrested from this tour, Tony Williams and Elvin Jones, and the tour came to an end a week early because of that. And that stopped jazz musicians going to Japan for about 2 years.
Oh.
Nobody was invited. And I think the first groups that went back to Japan were about 1968.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
The association of jazz with drugs and so forth is pretty documented. Has it changed over the years? Has it gotten better or worse?
Oh, yeah, most definitely.
Yeah.
It's gotten better because life in America has gotten better.
Mm-hmm.
As we pinpointed racism a little more and made things better for African American people, narcotics stopped a little bit
Mm-hmm.
in the jazz musician, a lot, I should say, in the jazz musician community. You know, it's really difficult being Duke Ellington's band and traveling through the South in the 30s. There are no hotels. Being Billie Holiday, being Bessie Smith, being Louis Armstrong. There are no hotels, there are no places to eat. I mean, I know of stories that even Louis Armstrong in his heyday in the 50s would turn away from being able to go and urinate in a restaurant using their bathroom in Connecticut. Okay, so it's this kind of stuff that placed very high in the use of narcotics among jazz artists who were going through this stuff. You know? And as a lot of that disappeared, we found many of the artists no longer dealing with heavy narcotics. And it's gotten much better as time has gone on. The problems that we had in the 40s and the 50s with our narcotics, they're having those problems in various places in Europe in the 90s and 2000. You know, in some countries, heavy narcotics is very prevalent, with many of the musicians being strung out shooting heroin in 1995, 96, 97, 98. You know, whereas we don't find too many of the younger musicians who are coming up in America even approaching that.
Do you think there's a misdirected opinion with some of the European musicians that the narcotics help you to play this?
I think that being one of the things, but just the whole overall drug culture of America of the 60s has transplanted itself and kind of shows a little bit of how behind the time they are in some countries. It took 30 years for it to get there. You know?
That's it's interesting because for so many years, you know, the United States would borrow from Europe, and now it's definitely gone the other way.
Right.
You know, of course, jazz has become so international now, as we can see from this weekend. It's wonderful to see that this music has been spread around.
Well, it is wonderful, and there are many, many fine jazz artists who have developed in the last 20 years in many countries of the world. And in some countries, they can hold their own with Americans. You know, some certain instruments. They can hold their own with Americans. The thing that I don't find being the case is that there is not that sense of originality. But you see, that is what has been happening since the middle 80s for the last 15 years, we can say, that we haven't seen musicians in our country coming out with that sense of originality. It's a sense of being able to duplicate what was done 30, 40 years ago. Oh, I want to play like those Blue Note records of the 60s, you know, and people learning how to play and duplicating that stuff. I heard a saxophonist in Europe, and he sounded so much like Dexter Gordon, I was shocked. You know, many people in foreign countries are content on the duplication process as opposed to the originality process.
Why do you suppose it's happened here since the mid-'80s?
Well, I think when the overall concept of making stars changed. You see, when I came up, stars were made on the bandstand. You practiced your instrument at home, and you went out and played, and the musician said, "Wow, man, you hear so-and-so, boy, he sure is, he can play his buns off it, yeah." And the musicians would talk about you, which would allow you to get more work with the musicians, which allowed more people in the audience to hear you, and before long you were making a name for yourself. And you got put on some recordings with some musicians and whatnot. That's how stars were made. Stars were not made by public relations. And that's what happened in the 80s. Wynton Marsalis is one of the first. Okay. Before that, we had other people who were being pushed into that position slowly but surely. Chuck Mangione. The machinery made him a star. Given all of these people still can play, they're great players, but the overall star-making machinery has changed. And with the advent of Wynton Marsalis and the star-making machinery happening there, they started doing this more and more with people.
Yeah, they see that as a success.
Right. And it's a big difference between how one has to deal with it. And I think because of this, stars were made of people who were not ready to be in the stardom. Their skill level was not ready. Their mindset was not ready. Yet when the money started to come in, they may have changed some of that stuff, but they were still basically not ready to be stars.
Yeah.
Not ready to be the John Coltrane, the Cannonball Adderley, the Kenny Drew, the Blue Mitchell, who had to work on the bandstand to be noticed, to become a S-T-A-R.
Well put. You think that present day some of these young musicians, obviously they have their own bands too soon?
Yeah, most definitely.
Okay.
Because
just to follow up on basically what you were saying.
Basically, being a band leader is much more than playing the right notes, like you said.
Yeah. Right.
And that's what a lot of people, I was witness to a concert that Roy Hargrove did as one of his first concerts after recording and having a band. And the programming was abominable. He did not know how to program his music to make this audience feel like they wanted to be a part of what was happening on the bandstand. And he had to do a workshop after that. He had no idea how to do a workshop. And fortunately for him, Rodney Whitaker was the bassist in his band at that time, who knew something about education and put this thing together and took over the workshop, and it became something very meaningful. But this is an example of being placed in that position to do things that a so-called star is supposed to do, and not knowing what to do because you just haven't had the experience.
Yeah.
I'm sure by now Roy knows how to program better, and I do feel that he can do workshops better. But that being the first, that was a problem.
You've had a lot of other things you've done with business administration and collective black artists. What kind of led you down that path of?
Just being a jazz musician.
Yeah.
Being a jazz musician and noticing what was happening to those around me. not being so isolated in my situation that I was the only thing that existed. But I started to notice what was happening to other musicians. And a few of us were like that. And as we came together and formed this organization called the Collective Black Artists to try to help the musicians who were around us change their destiny a little bit, to become more in control of their destiny. And one thing led to the other. As I had mentioned earlier, you know, mentors like Donald Byrd and Randy Weston helped me to understand the business side of music. And then in speaking, after getting to know these many musicians and speaking with people like Horace Silver and Benny Golson and Quincy Jones, they taught me more. Because I was always very inquisitive. J.J. Johnson remembers me as that little kid that was around reading Hindemith books, and he said, "What's that you're reading?" I said, "This book here." He said, "What, Paul Hindemith? That's the stuff that I'm into right now." You know? And I was reading this stuff early and saying, well, I was always there, and I was always asking questions, trying to get answers. So that led me to want to help musicians understand the industry that they were in. So in 1969, I started a course called The Business Aspects of the Music Industry, where I taught as part of the Institute of Education that the Collective Black Artists formed to teach this course to aspiring professionals and professionals. And that's how I got more and more into this stuff, just relating what I was fortunate enough to be told and taught by those that came before me.
Great. Passing it on.
Yeah.
Excellent. Here's kind of a tricky question sometimes. When you're improvising on a particular tune, is it possible to put into words what goes through your head?
Yeah, it's possible. The thing that is going through my head most of the time is what it is I want to create. And this is one of the things that I teach, that all of the technical end of the music should be in your subconscious mind, should have been learned to such an extent that it is in your subconscious mind, allowing your conscious mind just to deal with that process of creativity at that moment. And whatever song you're playing, that you should know it well enough that you don't have to think about, oh, this is a D minor 7 going to an E half diminished 7 going to A7. You don't have to think about that. That is in your subconscious, allowing you just to create. Because that's the way the masters did it all along. Art Tatum was not thinking of this one chord when he was playing.
Yeah.
He had worked through all of that so he could create a line. John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, they're not thinking of that kind of stuff. They're able to divorce themselves from that and go right ahead with the creative process. So that's basically what is in my mind.
Good.
Dealing with the creative process.
Wow. What's on your plate these days?
Well, I've been a band leader since 1969. I haven't been leading a band now for about 7, 8 years. I've been doing projects, the kind of projects that I like, you know, along with other people. I stopped leading the band because I was just tired. From 1976 to about 1981, I was very busy with my band, performing in some of the most unknown places of the world where jazz has never been live. I did concerts in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador and Belize and Honduras and Senegal and Khartoum and the Middle East. You know, some of these were for State Department tours. What I'm doing now is setting up different kinds of projects. I do college concerts with schools and bands, try to get them to hire me all the time,
Yeah.
to come in with my music, to do workshops. You know. Matter of fact, Hamilton College should be hiring me at some point, you know, to come there and do some workshops and concerts with their band, you know, playing my music,
Yep.
you know, playing music of the masters that I've arranged, music that I've collected over the years, original arrangements that I own by Benny Golson, by Dizzy Gillespie, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I just finished, I did a concert this New Year's Eve, 2001, in Italy. I wrote some music for a dance company,
Oh,
and we
nice.
performed in the piazza. It stopped raining at 10 o'clock, and I started at 11. Okay. And it didn't rain anymore that night.
Excellent.
It started to rain about 7 o'clock in the morning. And me and my wife were there from the 23rd of December to the 4th of January. It rained every day in Rome. Every day. And I'm not talking about drizzle. I'm talking about hard, hard rain. It was so shocking that the people in Rome were shocked about the Tiber River because it had risen so high. They had never seen it that high.
Wow.
I'm not doing any recording right now, but I have done some recordings, you know, in the last number of years, but very little really compared to what I used to do. I have no record company, and it seems like there's no record company is interested in Jimmy Owens. I mean, they sign the 20-year-old,
Yes.
the 25-year-old, and they've forgotten about what I call the jazz in the Middle Ages. You know, those middle-aged musicians who are at the peak of their skill level,
Right.
but the industry doesn't want to deal with them for some reason. You know.
You're not the first person who I've heard say that,
Yeah,
fortunately.
I coined that whole concept of jazz in the Middle
Jazz in
Ages.
the Middle Ages.
And it was, I remember a number of years ago, it was an article written in the New York Times, I think it was in '88 or something. It talked about that. And at first people thought it was a joke, but they saw the seriousness of what I was speaking about, and how these various musicians have been overlooked. And people just didn't think about them as being overlooked because they were still in their mind. It's not that they were seeing them on television or hearing them all the time on radio, but it was in their mind. You know, well, Jimmy Heath exists, you know, and this person exists, you know. Now I've moved into that period of the Middle Ages, and, you know, I'm seeing it happening to me and those around me. So the most important thing is to keep your spirits up and do the projects. I stay rather busy doing the kinds of things I like to do. And that's what's most important.
Good. Good. Well, this has really been a fascinating conversation. Is there anything that perhaps I didn't ask you that?
Well, there's
like
one
to
thing
ask
that I
them?
would like to speak about. I mean, we, you know, all of the people that I performed with over the years, we mentioned some of them, and then people like Max Roach and Art Blakey and Billy Taylor, working with Duke Ellington and Count Basie. All of that has been a very important part of my performing career. We talked about the collective black artists. Well, that existed from 1969 to about 1978. For the last 11 years, I've been involved in an organization called the Jazz Foundation of America, and our program is called the Jazz Musician Emergency Fund. We help jazz artists who are in need. The need could be a financial need, a medical need, career development problem, a substance abuse problem. We have a few hospitals that we're affiliated with where we get free hospital services for those musicians, most of them who don't have health insurance. Okay. And this has been very rewarding. We help musicians in all walks of life. And we've been doing this for 10 years with this program, the Jazz Musician Emergency Fund, all over the United States. And we've helped many, many jazz artists. And we've had a lot of help also. You know, we're getting more help as time goes on. Every now and then you may pick up Playboy magazine. In this February issue of Playboy magazine, they run the advertisement quite often near the back of the magazine after all of the pictures. There's an ad that talks about the Jazz Foundation of America and the Jazz Musician Emergency Fund.
Yeah.
And we usually get some donations from that. We've gotten grants, and we're working on trying to get more of the music industry to help the jazz musician community. You know, there's an organization called Music Cares that helps the music community, and the record industry is all in there. Music Cares has millions of dollars. Well, the Jazz Foundation doesn't have millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we're trying to get to that point to help more of the jazz musician community. So that's been a very important part of my life. Service things have been coming into the picture in the last number of years. I got very involved with the Musicians Union in helping them organize a jazz advisory committee to help jazz artists get things like benefits. You know. So that takes up some of my time, and I'm trying my best not to let it take up any more.
Yeah.
Because I still need to sit down and practice. I still need to go out and play concerts all over the world for my spirit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those are some of the things that I'm involved in. I love it all. I love being a musician, and I speak with many friends in other fields. I have a filmmaker friend who's Tunisian, who lives in Tunisia, but he lives in Paris also. And we've spoken many times how lucky we are that we're doing what we want to do, and people are accepting what we want to do. They love what we want to do, and they even pay us for what we want to do.
Well, on that note, it's a good summation of a lot of things.
Thank you for inviting
It's
me.
been very, very enjoyable for me, so I appreciate your time and wish you best of luck with all your projects.
Thank you
Thanks
very
a lot.
much.